I was sitting in a hard, plastic chair in the doctor's waiting room when my phone began to vibrate. I saw it was my only daughter, Angela, and I picked it up with a small smile, expecting a check-in. Instead, her voice sounded disturbingly cold, devoid of the warmth she had shown me just days before. "Mom, we're going on a trip to Europe tomorrow," she said curtly. "I already sold your beach house and your car. We needed the money for the move. Bye." Before I could even process the words, the line went dead. I sat there in stunned silence, the air in the waiting room feeling suddenly very thin. For 45 years, I had poured my entire life into her, sacrificing my own needs and desires to ensure she had everything she ever wanted. Now, she had discarded me like a piece of worthless trash, leaving me with nothing but the clothes on my back and a few personal belongings. Yet, despite the sting of her betrayal, a strange smile touched my lips. I took a deep breath and looked at the phone, because there was something my dear daughter simply didn't know. My name is Antonia Brooks. I am 71 years old, and until that precise second, I truly thought I knew my child. My world had been shattered 6 months ago when my husband, Robert, passed away from a sudden heart attack. It happened right at the breakfast table, just as we had done every single morning for our entire marriage. He had just served me my coffee with cream and a side of toast. He kissed my forehead, whispered, "Good morning, my love," and those became the very last words he would ever speak to me. In the months following Robert's death, Angela had seemingly stepped up. She visited me 3 times a week, helped me navigate the confusing maze of funeral arrangements, and accompanied me on mundane trips to the grocery store. She had even been the one to insist I see a doctor for a general checkup, telling me I needed to take better care of myself now that I was alone. She said it with a smile that I mistook for genuine love. Now, I realized that smile was merely a mask for her own convenience and greed. The beach house she had sold so casually had been our family sanctuary for decades. Robert and I had purchased it when Angela was 15, through years of disciplined saving and hard work. It was where we built our most precious memories, celebrating every birthday, summer holiday, and Christmas. Angela would bring her boyfriends there, and later her husband, Edward. I spent those summers cooking massive meals, cleaning up after everyone, and doing endless loads of laundry. I never imagined she viewed that sacred place as nothing more than a quick cash grab. Then there was the car, Robert's old Ford pickup truck. He had cared for that vehicle as if it were his own child. Every Sunday afternoon, without fail, he would wash it and change the oil religiously. He always parked it in the exact same spot under the shade of the old oak tree in our driveway. Angela knew exactly what that truck meant to me. It was the physical manifestation of Robert's presence. His scent still lingered on the worn fabric of the seats, and now, it was gone, sold off to a stranger for a few dollars. As I sat on that uncomfortable green plastic chair surrounded by other patients, I found that for the first time in months, I didn't want to cry. A peculiar sense of calm washed over me, a feeling I hadn't experienced since the day Robert died. In that moment of absolute betrayal, a memory surfaced from the depths of my grief. 3 days before he passed, Robert had handed me a thick manila envelope with a very serious look on his face. He told me to put it in my dresser drawer and only open it when I felt truly ready. I had tucked it away and promptly forgotten about it. The fog of grief and the chaos of the funeral had pushed it entirely out of my mind. But now, it was waiting for me at home, a silent message from the man who had loved me for nearly half a century. The nurse finally called my name, and I went into the doctor's office in a daze. He examined me and gave me a clean bill of health, suggesting only that I eat better and rest. I nodded and smiled politely, but my mind was already racing toward that envelope. I left the clinic and walked slowly toward the bus stop. Technically, according to my daughter, I no longer had a vehicle. As I waited for the bus, I couldn't help but feel a sense of poetic justice brewing. Angela believed she had left me destitute and broken, but she had no idea that Robert was a man who always thought 10 steps ahead. The bus arrived, and I found a seat by the window, watching the city blur past. Everyone has their own secrets and tragedies, and I was about to uncover mine. When I finally reached my house, I went straight to my bedroom and opened the dresser drawer. There it was, the manila envelope, sitting exactly where I had left it months ago. My hands shook slightly as I pulled it out. Robert had written my name on the front in his neat, practiced handwriting. I sat on the edge of the bed we had shared for so many years and took a deep breath. The house was filling with shadows as evening approached, but for the first time, the darkness didn't feel heavy or frightening. I opened the envelope slowly, as if it were a fragile gift. What I found inside was enough to take my breath away. It wasn't just a simple note. It was a collection of legal deeds, bank certificates, and a long, handwritten letter. My eyes filled with tears as I began to read Robert's words. "My dear Antonia," he wrote, "if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. Forgive me for keeping secrets, but I wanted to protect you from the worries of the world and the pressures of our wealth." As I read further, the scale of his secret life became clear. Over the decades, Robert hadn't just been a bus driver. He had been a meticulous and brilliant investor. He explained that we didn't just own the beach house. We owned 6 other properties across the city, including a downtown condominium and a small motel on the coast. Most shockingly, the letter revealed that we owned the 20-story apartment building where Angela and Edward currently lived. I wasn't just a widow with a small pension. I was a very wealthy woman. Robert had been the silent owner of these assets for over 10 years, operating through a private holding company I had never heard of. According to the documents, I was now the sole heir to that company and all its holdings. There were bank statements attached with balances that seemed entirely surreal to me. Every penny we had ever pinched, every vacation we had skipped, and every sacrifice we had made had been multiplied by Robert's financial savvy. He had done it all in silence to ensure I would never be in want. In his letter, Robert revealed his true motivation for the secrecy. He knew our daughter's character better than I did. He wrote Antonia, "If Angela knew we had this kind of money, her attitude toward us would change instantly. I wanted her to love us for who we are, not for what we could give her." It was a heartbreakingly accurate assessment. Our daughter had abandoned me because she thought I was a financial burden, never realizing that I actually held the keys to her very home and her future. That night, sleep was an impossibility. I wandered through the rooms of my house, touching the old furniture that Angela always complained was outdated and tacky. I looked at the framed photos on the walls, focusing on a picture of Angela when she was 5, sitting on Robert's lap. I wondered where that innocent, laughing little girl had gone. I searched for the moment she had become so transactional and cold, but I couldn't find it. The betrayal was complete, but the power dynamic had shifted entirely without her knowing. Early the next morning, the phone rang again. It was Angela, and this time her voice was sickeningly sweet, a sharp contrast to the ice from the day before. "Mom, how are you? I just wanted to tell you we transferred the money from the house and car sales into your account," she said. She told me it wasn't a lot, but that it would help me survive for a few months while I looked for a smaller place to live. I kept my voice perfectly calm and asked her what she meant by my share. She had the audacity to tell me that they were giving me 30% of the proceeds, as if she were being incredibly generous. "We need the rest for Edward's business opportunity in Europe," she explained. "It's an incredible chance for us." I realized then that she was essentially stealing 70% of my own assets to fund a vacation for her husband, a man who had always treated me like an inconvenience. I simply told her to have a safe trip and hung up the phone. I sat there and laughed. It was a genuine, deep laugh that I hadn't felt in a long time. The situation was so absurd it had become comical. My daughter had committed fraud, sold my home, and was now talking to me with a level of condescension that was almost impressive. She thought she was leaving me with a pittance, while she headed off to Europe on a fool's errand. She had no idea that I could effectively evict her from her own apartment with a single phone call if I so chose. I checked my bank account online and saw the deposit. It was a mockery of the true value of the beach house and Robert's truck. They had clearly sold everything in a rush, desperate for liquid cash to fund their getaway. Later that afternoon, I watched from behind my curtains as they loaded their expensive new luggage into a taxi. They were laughing and kissing, looking like two people without a care in the world. They didn't once look back at my window to say goodbye. They were already gone in their minds. Once the taxi disappeared from view, I sat at my kitchen table and spread Robert's documents out before me. I knew I had to act, but I didn't want to just lash out in anger. I wanted to handle this with the same quiet dignity that Robert had lived his life. I called Mr. Peterson, the lawyer who had been a friend to Robert for years. He had been at the funeral and had told me to call if I ever needed anything. He sounded surprised but pleased to hear from me when he answered. The next morning, I dressed with more care than I had in months. I wore a wine-colored dress that Robert had always loved and fixed my hair neatly. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman of substance and strength. I drove to the downtown office building where Mr. Peterson worked. When I laid the documents out on his desk, his professional mask slipped. He was floored by the extent of Robert's investments. "Mrs. Brooks, this is incredible," he whispered, staring at the deeds. Mr. Peterson confirmed that the documents were perfectly legal and that I was indeed the sole owner of the holding company. He also confirmed my suspicion that the sale of the beach house was entirely fraudulent. Since Angela didn't have my power of attorney or any legal claim to the deed, she had effectively committed a crime to sell it. He told me we could file charges immediately and have the house back within days. However, I told him I wanted to take a different, more subtle approach. I told Mr. Peterson that I wanted to keep my wealth a complete secret for now. I didn't want to see Angela in jail, but I did want her to learn a very expensive lesson. I instructed him to begin the process of quietly nullifying the sale of the beach house and gaining full active control over the apartment building where Angela and Edward lived. I wanted to be the invisible hand moving the pieces on the board. He looked at me with newfound respect and agreed to handle everything discreetly. Walking out of his office, I felt like I was finally waking up from a long, dark nightmare. The world looked different, vibrant, and full of possibility. For the first time since Robert died, I had a mission. I spent the next few weeks playing the part of the lonely, struggling widow while Mr. Peterson worked behind the scenes. Every time Angela called from Europe to brag about her expensive dinners and luxury hotels, I would simply listen and offer a soft, "That's nice, dear," while looking at my growing portfolio. Mr. Peterson worked efficiently, and soon the beach house was legally back in my name. The buyers, who were likely in on the shady deal, were forced to settle quietly to avoid criminal charges. Next, we moved on to the apartment building. I became the new management company, though my name was buried deep within layers of corporate paperwork. I watched from afar as Angela's lifestyle in Europe began to drain the money she had stolen from me, unaware that the foundation of her life back home was shifting. Living in my house alone gave me time to reflect on Robert's wisdom. He had known that money could poison a person's heart, and he had seen that poison in Angela long before I did. I realized that my unconditional love for her had blinded me to her selfishness. Now, the blinders were off. I wasn't acting out of a desire for revenge, but out of a need for justice. I wanted to ensure that when Angela finally discovered the truth, it would be at a time when she was forced to face the reality of her actions. As the weeks turned into months, I began to enjoy my new life. I visited the other properties Robert had bought, marveling at his foresight. I met with the managers of the companies he had invested in, and realized that I had a natural knack for business that I had never been allowed to use. I was no longer just Antonia Brooks, the bus driver's widow. I was a woman of means with a future I had never dared to imagine. And through it all, I felt Robert's presence guiding me, his silent love still protecting me. I decided to keep the beach house exactly as it was, a monument to the happy years we had spent there. I even tracked down Robert's old Ford pickup truck. The man who bought it had barely used it, and I paid him double what he had given Angela just to get it back. When I sat in the driver's seat and smelled the faint scent of Robert's cologne, I finally allowed myself to cry. They were tears of relief and gratitude. I was no longer a discarded piece of garbage. I was the architect of my own destiny. One day, Mr. Peterson called with a specific piece of news. Angela and Edward were planning to return from Europe earlier than expected because their investment had failed, and they were running out of money. They were counting on returning to their apartment and finding me a small, cheap room somewhere else. I smiled at the phone and told Mr. Peterson it was time to move to the next phase of our plan. I wanted to be there to welcome them home, but not in the way they expected. The day of their return arrived, and I was waiting in the lobby of their apartment building. I had dressed in my finest clothes, looking every bit the woman of wealth I now was. When Angela and Edward walked through the doors, looking tired and bedraggled, their jaws dropped. They expected to see a broken woman begging for help. Instead, they saw me standing there with my lawyer. "Welcome home, Angela," I said, my voice steady and clear. "We have a lot to discuss regarding your lease and your recent sales back home." The look of pure shock on Angela's face was something I would never forget. She tried to stammer out an excuse, but Mr. Peterson stepped forward with the legal documents. I told her that I knew everything about the beach house, the car, and the fact that I was now her landlord. I saw the gears turning in her head as she realized the magnitude of her mistake. She had tried to leave me with nothing, only to find out that I now held everything she valued. I didn't kick them out on the street that day. Instead, I gave them a choice. They could work to pay back every cent they had stolen, or they could face the legal consequences of their fraud. Angela wept, finally realizing the depth of her betrayal and the grace I was offering her. It was a long road ahead for our relationship, but for the first time in years, the power was balanced. I walked out of the building and got into Robert's old truck, feeling a deep sense of peace. As I drove toward the beach house, I looked at the manila envelope on the passenger seat. Robert had given me more than just money. He had given me my life back. He had seen the storm coming and had built me a lighthouse. I knew that the memories we had made were still there, safe and sound. And as the sun began to set over the ocean, I whispered a final thank you to the man who had loved me enough to plan for a future he would never see. Every single morning began with the same comforting, if predictable, routine. I would wake up in the quiet house, prepare my breakfast, and sit at the very same table where Robert and I had shared 45 years of conversation and companionship. Once I finished my meal, I would head out for a long walk through the neighborhood. It was during these walks that I encountered the neighbors, most of whom greeted me with a specific look, a heavy mixture of pity and intense curiosity that people usually reserve for recent widows. They saw a woman they thought was broken, and I let them believe it. One sunny afternoon, while I was tending to the plants in my front yard, my lifelong neighbor, Aurora, approached me. She had a look of deep concern on her face as she leaned over the fence. "Antonia, dear," she began, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Is it true that Angela went off to Europe and left you all alone in this big house?" I looked at her and nodded calmly, confirming that she had indeed left with Edward to pursue some vague business plans. Aurora's face twisted into an expression of pure sympathy as she asked how I would manage to survive. She reminded me, in that way neighbors often do, that everyone assumed Robert hadn't left behind much of a fortune. I looked at her kind, concerned face and thought to myself, if you only knew the truth. Out loud, I simply told her not to worry, and that I would be perfectly fine. Aurora offered to bring me food or help with my groceries, her eyes filled with a relief that clearly stemmed from the fact that this wasn't her own personal tragedy. I thanked her for her kindness, but inside, I was secretly enjoying the elaborate performance of my double life. This same scenario played out almost everywhere I went. Whether it was the local butcher, the baker, or the woman at the corner convenience store, everyone spoke to me in that hushed, soft tone people use when they are speaking to the truly unfortunate. I would nod, offer a small, sad smile, and thank them for their heartfelt concern. It was a strange experience, living as a poor widow in the eyes of the public, while knowing that, in reality, I held the deeds to their favorite shops and the very buildings they lived in. On a Wednesday morning, the phone rang, and it was Mr. Peterson with an update. His voice was bright with professional satisfaction as he delivered the good news. He had successfully managed to nullify the fraudulent sale of my beach house. The buyers had been entirely unaware that Angela didn't have the legal right to sell the property, so they received their money back from the escrow account without any further legal hurdles. "The house is yours again, Antonia," he said. I felt a surge of triumph, but I kept my voice measured as I thanked him. He went on to explain that the situation with the apartment building where Angela lived was a bit more complex. While I had technically been the owner through Robert's holding company for years, we needed to make several administrative changes to move that control into my direct name. He estimated it would take another 2 weeks to finalize the paperwork and give me total authority over the property. I told him that was perfect and asked him to keep me informed of every step. As I hung up, my thoughts immediately drifted toward my daughter. Angela had been in Europe for 3 weeks at that point, and the silence from her end was deafening. There had been no phone calls, no quick text messages, and not even a simple postcard to let me know she was safe. It was clear that, to her, I had ceased to exist the very moment she had secured the funds she needed for her trip. She viewed me as a resource that had been fully tapped out. However, I knew that her perception of reality was about to be shattered very soon. I decided to take a trip to the beach house to see it for myself. I took the bus to the coast, following the same scenic route that Robert and I had traveled hundreds of times over the years. When I arrived, the house looked exactly as I remembered it, a charming, cream-colored structure with a wide porch that offered a perfect view of the crashing waves. The temporary owners had added a few potted plants to the steps, but otherwise, the sanctuary Robert and I had built remained untouched by the chaos of the last few months. I sat on the curb across the street for a full hour, just staring at the house and letting the memories wash over me. I pictured the summer afternoons when Angela was just a little girl, running across the sand and building elaborate castles. I could almost smell the fish Robert used to grill on the barbecue while I tossed salads in the kitchen. I thought about how many friends and boyfriends she had brought there, eventually bringing Edward into our inner circle. It was heartbreaking to realize she had reduced all those years of love to a simple transaction. As I sat there, an older gentleman stepped out of the house and noticed me. He walked over with a curious but kind expression and asked if I was all right. I told him I was just remembering old times and that I knew the former owners very well. He shook his head sadly and remarked on what a shame the whole situation was. He explained that they had been told the elderly owner was deathly ill and needed a quick sale for medical expenses. They thought they were getting a bargain, only to find out the daughter had no right to sell. I listened as he described how the daughter Angela had handled everything through intermediaries, claiming her mother was too incapacitated to speak for herself. It was a heavy blow to hear how easily she had lied about my health and my sanity just to get her hands on the money. She hadn't seen me as a mother or even a human being. I was just a legal obstacle that needed to be bypassed with a fabricated story. I left the coast that day with a heart that felt like lead, realizing the depth of her deception. That evening, I called Mr. Peterson with a new mission. I told him I wanted to get Robert's Ford pickup truck back as well. He warned me that it would be difficult because the truck was in my name, and Angela had used a power of attorney to sell it. I was confused until he reminded me that I had signed several papers in the weeks following Robert's death. In my haze of grief and confusion, I had trusted her completely and signed documents I hadn't even read. I felt like a fool, but I told him to proceed anyway. Over the following weeks, my life took on a very strange, dual rhythm. In the mornings, I played the part of the destitute widow, buying only the necessities and keeping up the appearance of a woman struggling to get by. But in the afternoons, I transformed into a calculated businesswoman. I spent hours studying Robert's investment portfolios, consulting with Mr. Peterson, and plotting my next moves. I discovered that Robert hadn't just been lucky. He had been a visionary who saw the potential in real estate long before anyone else. The apartment building where Angela and Edward lived was a prime example of his genius. It wasn't just generating steady rent. It was located in a neighborhood that was currently exploding in value. I also uncovered a startling piece of information about Edward. It turned out my son-in-law was drowning in secret debt. He had taken out several massive loans using their apartment as collateral, entirely unaware that the building was actually owned by my holding company. When the banks realized he had no legal title to the property, he was going to be in ruin. Finally, Mr. Peterson called with the news I had been waiting for. All the paperwork was finished, and I had total, indisputable control over every single one of my properties. He had even managed to track down Robert's truck. The buyer happened to be an acquaintance of his, and once the fraudulent nature of the sale was explained, he agreed to return the vehicle in exchange for a small, fair compensation. I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I told him there was just one more thing I needed him to do. I asked him to send an eviction notice to my daughter. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. Mr. Peterson asked if I was absolutely certain I wanted to take such a drastic step against my own child. I told him I was completely sure. Angela had decided that I was no longer an important part of her life, and now she was going to find out exactly how much power I truly held. I instructed him to have the letter waiting for her the moment she returned from her trip. That same afternoon, Aurora came rushing over to my house, breathless with the latest neighborhood gossip. She told me that Edward was in massive trouble with the bank. Her brother-in-law, who worked in finance, had let it slip that they were investigating fraudulent loans Edward had taken out using an apartment he didn't actually own. Rumors were swirling that Angela had no idea about the debt and that she was rushing back from Europe to deal with the fallout. It seemed Edward's house of cards was finally collapsing. It turned out, Edward had lied to Angela about the entire European business venture. There was no incredible opportunity. He was simply trying to flee his creditors and use the money stolen from me to hide out in luxury. Everything was unfolding exactly as I had anticipated. Angela had sacrificed her relationship with her mother for a man who was now revealed to be a liar and a coward. I sat on my porch that night, looking up at the stars and thanking Robert for his foresight. He was still taking care of me. The next morning, Mr. Peterson called to inform me that Angela had landed at the airport alone. Apparently, she and Edward had a monumental falling out in Europe once his lies were exposed, and he had chosen to stay behind while she fled back home. I told the lawyer to ensure the eviction notice was delivered immediately. After weeks of silent, meticulous planning, the time had finally come to step out of the shadows. Angela was about to realize that her vulnerable mother was actually the one holding all the cards. Angela arrived at her apartment on Tuesday night, looking like a ghost of her former self. Aurora told me the next day that she looked terrible, pale, thin, and clearly exhausted from crying. She didn't even have her own keys, as Edward had kept them, and she had to be let in by the building's superintendent. My daughter was back, she was alone, and she was about to receive a very unpleasant welcome home gift from the holding company she had never heard of, Robert Investments, Inc. Later that afternoon, Mr. Peterson confirmed that the eviction notice had been served in person. He asked me one last time if I had considered the implications of what I was doing. I told him I had considered everything. My daughter had treated me like a disposable object, and now she was going to learn that every action has a consequence. I spent the night wide awake, imagining the moment she would read that letter. The confusion would turn to panic, and eventually, she would have nowhere left to turn but back to me. At 8 o'clock the next morning, my phone rang. It was Angela, and she sounded absolutely frantic. She told me she had received a letter saying she had to vacate her apartment in 30 days and asked if I knew anything about it. She mentioned the name of the company, and I felt a surge of poetic satisfaction. I played the part of the confused mother perfectly, telling her I had never heard of such a company. She began to sob, telling me through her tears that Edward had abandoned her for another woman in Europe. She was left with nothing, no husband, no money, and now, no home. The irony was almost too much to bear. Now that the man she had chosen over me was gone, she suddenly remembered she had a mother. She asked if she could come over to talk, claiming she had no one else left in the world. I told her of course she could come over. I hung up the phone and looked in the mirror, adjusting my gray dress and practicing my worried mother expression. I was ready for the final act. When Angela arrived an hour later, I was shocked by her appearance. Her expensive clothes were wrinkled, her hair was a mess, and she looked as though she hadn't slept in a week. She looked like she wanted to hug me, but she hesitated, likely remembering the cold way she had ended our last conversation. I invited her in and offered her some coffee. We sat down at the kitchen table, the very same place where I had uncovered the secrets of Robert's wealth. The stage was set, and the truth was finally ready to be revealed. Angela looked remarkably small, sitting in that chair, appearing lost and vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen since she was a little girl coming to me with her schoolyard troubles. "Mom, I am so incredibly sorry for the way I left things," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know I didn't treat you well, and I lived like you didn't matter." I looked at her and told her it was in the past, but she shook her head vehemently. She admitted that she had said horrible things and treated me with a coldness I didn't deserve. Now, her voice broke completely, as she confessed that she had absolutely no one left in the world. I asked her what had happened with Edward, and the story she told was one of classic, devastating betrayal. It turned out he had abandoned her in Paris for a 25-year-old hotel waitress. The business opportunity in Europe had been a complete fabrication from the start. It was a lie designed to help him escape the mounting debts he had accumulated back home. He had used the money from the sale of my beach house and my truck to fund his escape and his new life, leaving Angela with nothing but the fallout of his financial crimes. Angela explained that Edward had been taking out loans for years, using the apartment they lived in as collateral without her knowledge. She was shocked to discover that he wasn't actually the owner of the apartment, which led to the eviction notice. I saw my opportunity to dig deeper into the mystery without revealing my hand. I told her I didn't know how that was possible, noting that property matters are often very complicated. She was terrified because the banks were now coming after her for his debts, claiming that as his wife, she was legally responsible for the hundreds of thousands of dollars he owed. She started to cry with a sense of genuine desperation that moved me. "Mom, I don't know what to do," she sobbed. "I have no money, no job, and nowhere else to go." For a fleeting moment, my mother's heart softened, and I wanted to pull her into a hug and tell her that I was actually a millionaire who could fix everything. But then the memory of her cold voice on the phone at the doctor's office returned to me. I remembered the ease with which she had discarded me when she thought I was a burden. I needed her to understand the weight of her choices before I saved her. I asked if she had spoken to a lawyer, but she laughed bitterly through her tears, saying she had no money for legal counsel. Edward had taken every last cent when he ran off. Then came the question I had been anticipating since the moment I opened Robert's manila envelope. She asked if she could stay with me for a while until she found a job and a small place of her own. She was asking the poor widow she had created to rescue her from the very poverty she had inflicted on me. I told her that this would always be her home. Angela looked at me with genuine surprise, clearly shocked that I would be so forgiving after everything she had done. I told her that she was my daughter and that would never change, which prompted a desperate, clinging hug. I hugged her back, but the warmth was gone. My embrace was now filled with strategy and calculation. I told her to rest and recover, and that we would look at her options later. As she went to her apartment to gather the few belongings she had left, I stayed in the kitchen, marveling at how perfectly the first phase of my plan had executed. That night, I called Mr. Peterson to move into the next phase. I instructed him to investigate the full extent of Edward's debts and find out exactly how we could legally separate Angela from his financial crimes. I told him to keep the investigation an absolute secret, emphasizing that no one could know I was the one pulling the strings. He asked what my final plan was, and I told him it was simple. I was going to save my daughter. But only after she truly understood what it felt like to hit rock bottom. I poured a glass of Robert's special occasion wine and toasted to the game. Angela moved in the next day with just 2 suitcases and a single cardboard box, the pathetic remains of her once glamorous life. Watching her unpack in her childhood bedroom was a study in humiliation. She had gone from a luxury condo to the very room where she had once complained about being bored. As she was going through a box of Edward's things she had salvaged, she found another manila envelope with my name on it in Robert's handwriting. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I kept my face neutral as I took the envelope from her. This envelope was smaller and looked newer than the first one. I speculated that Edward might have found it among Robert's things after the funeral and simply forgotten to hand it over. Inside, I found a short note and a small key. Robert's letter explained that if I was reading this, it meant our daughter was likely going through a difficult time. He told me the key opened a safety deposit box at the downtown branch of the central bank, containing something that could help me help her. He cautioned me to use it wisely, ending with his eternal love. Angela read the letter over my shoulder, her desperation palpable as she realized there might be a hidden treasure that could save her. I lied and told her I had no idea about a safety deposit box, feigning the same confusion she felt. She begged me to go see what was inside, hoping for documents or valuables that could settle her debts. I took a calculated pause before agreeing to go the next day. That night, she cooked dinner for us, but the meal was seasoned with her guilt and the heavy silence of our fractured relationship. During dinner, she confessed that Edward had forged her signature on several loan documents. She had trusted him with her personal information to handle their joint accounts, never dreaming he would use it to ruin her. She didn't even know where he was now. He had vanished completely, disconnecting his phone and deleting his email accounts. Edward had done me a favor by being the exact villain I needed him to be. Now Angela was experiencing the same betrayal I had felt when she abandoned me. She was finally learning that trust is a fragile thing. She lamented how she had ruined both of our lives, taking my house and truck for a man who didn't even love her. She believed we were just 2 poor women trying to survive, and I didn't correct her. If she only knew that I was currently the owner of her former apartment building and had more money than she could spend in 3 lifetimes. But the lesson wasn't over yet. The next morning, we went to the bank, and I continued my act of the confused elderly widow while the bank employee led us to box number 247. Inside the safety deposit box was a staggering collection of jewelry, emerald rings, pearl necklaces, and antique bracelets that had been in Robert's family for generations. Angela gasped at the sight of the treasure, immediately estimating that it must be worth a fortune. Robert's letter inside the box valued the collection at around $200,000. To me, it was a drop in the bucket compared to the rest of my assets, but to Angela, it was a literal lifesaver. I watched her eyes light up with a familiar, greedy glow before she caught herself. Her first instinct, even now, was to suggest selling the family heirlooms to pay off Edward's debts and get my beach house back. She still didn't realize that I already owned the beach house. I asked her if she was certain she wanted to use her father's legacy to pay for a criminal's mistakes. She argued that she had no other choice, as the banks were threatening foreclosure on everything. She felt trapped, believing that no employer would hire someone with so many legal and financial clouds hanging over their head. We took the jewelry home, and I watched with a heavy heart as she spread the pieces out on the kitchen table. She reduced decades of our family history to numbers on a spreadsheet, calculating the exact amount she could get for each item. She eventually decided she could get about $180,000, which she believed would be enough to satisfy the most urgent creditors. It was ironic that she was so worried about losing the house she was currently living in, a house that I legally owned and had no intention of selling. I noticed that the suffering of the last few weeks had changed her. She was becoming more responsible, investigating financial laws and prioritizing debts with real collateral. She was no longer the impulsive woman who sold my truck on a whim. She was a woman trying to survive a storm. However, she was still fragile. That night, Mr. Peterson called with a grim update on Edward's debt. It was far worse than $200,000, and because of the falsified documents, Angela was indeed legally on the hook for the entire amount. Mr. Peterson explained that even if she sold the jewelry, it wouldn't be enough to cover the total debt. She was essentially pouring water into a leaking bucket. I realized that the rock bottom I wanted her to hit was much deeper than I had originally planned. She was facing total financial ruin regardless of the jewelry. I told the lawyer to keep digging and to prepare a strategy where I could step in as the anonymous buyer of her debt, further tightening the net around her without her ever knowing it was me. The next day, Angela went to a high-end jeweler to get official appraisals. I watched her leave the house with the small velvet bags tucked into her purse, her shoulders hunched as if she were carrying the weight of the world. She returned hours later, looking defeated. The jeweler had offered her even less than she had hoped because some of the antique settings were damaged. She sat at the table and put her head in her hands. I sat across from her, offering a silent comfort that was half genuine and half performance. "Mom, even if I sell everything, I'm still going to be short," she admitted. I nodded slowly, telling her that we would find a way together. She looked at me with such genuine gratitude that I almost felt a twinge of guilt. Almost, I reminded myself that this was for her own good, that she needed to understand that wealth isn't just about numbers in a bank account, but about the integrity and the people you have in your life. I was preparing to give her a future, but first, I had to let her old life burn to the ground. She spent the following week in a feverish state of activity, trying to negotiate with the banks. I listened to her phone calls from the other room, hearing her plead with cold-voiced representatives who didn't care about her sob stories. She was learning the hard way that the world doesn't care about your intentions, only your signatures. She was finally seeing the convenience she had once lived by from the other side, and the view was terrifying. My plan was reaching its crescendo, and the reveal was only days away. As the 30-day eviction notice for her apartment approached its deadline, Angela became increasingly manic. She still hadn't sold the jewelry, torn between her need for the money and a newfound respect for the family history the pieces represented. I decided it was time for the final move. I called Mr. Peterson and told him to schedule a meeting at his office. I told Angela that a friend of Robert's had reached out and might be able to help us with the legal mess Edward had left behind. She clung to this news like a drowning person to a life raft. She spent the entire morning of the meeting making sure she looked professional, trying to reclaim some of the dignity she had lost. As we walked into Mr. Peterson's elegant downtown office, she was trembling. She had no idea that she wasn't meeting a friend of Robert's, but rather the silent architect of her entire ordeal. I sat next to her, the poor widow, until the very last second, before Mr. Peterson cleared his throat and opened a thick file. "Angela," the lawyer began, his voice grave and professional. "We have investigated the debts, the holding company, and the recent sales of the beach house and the truck." He then turned to me and nodded. I stood up, shed the weary posture of the grieving widow, and looked my daughter in the eye. "There is no Robert Investments mystery, Angela," I said firmly. "I am the company. I am the owner of your building. And I am the one who bought back your father's truck and the sanctuary you tried to sell." The silence in the room was absolute. I watched as the color drained from her face, her eyes widening as the pieces of the puzzle finally clicked into place. She realized that I hadn't been a victim at Alley, had been the one in control from the very beginning. I told her that I had let her feel the fear and the loss so she would never again treat people, or her own family, as disposable assets. I had saved her, but I had also shown her exactly what she had almost thrown away. Mr. Peterson explained that if we could prove Angela had no knowledge of the forgeries, we might be able to extricate her from the crushing weight of those debts. However, he warned me that it would be a grueling and incredibly expensive legal process. I asked him exactly how much a specialist in these types of fraud cases would cost, and he estimated at least $50,000, with no absolute guarantee of a favorable outcome. I absorbed this, knowing that the cost was irrelevant to me now, but a fortune to the version of myself my daughter believed in. I asked what would happen if the debts were simply paid off in full. Mr. Peterson noted that paying them would be the quickest solution, though he doubted Angela had access to that kind of capital. I instructed him to prepare all the necessary legal documents to clear her name, but I strictly forbade him from telling her anything yet. He was surprised that I was willing to pay such a high price, but I told him I would do whatever was necessary to protect her, provided it was handled in this very specific, educational way. When I returned home, I found Angela in the living room, staring at the family jewels with a deeply sorrowful expression. She looked lost, much like a child who had broken a favorite toy and realized it couldn't be mended with simple apologies. I asked her what she was thinking about, and she whispered that she was imagining how disappointed her father would be. She lamented that he had taught her to be responsible and to value family. Yet she had done the exact opposite by being selfish and following a liar. For the first time since her return, I heard a note of genuine moral regret in her voice. It wasn't just that she was sad about being poor. She was truly acknowledging that she had committed a moral wrong against the people who loved her most. She asked me how she could possibly fix the damage she had done, which was the exact question I had been waiting for. Angela was finally ready to face the truth, but it wasn't time to reveal my secret wealth just yet. She needed to feel the weight a little longer. Over the next few days, Angela decided to sell the majority of the jewelry. She chose to keep only the engagement ring Robert had given me and a small necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. I watched her painstakingly research prices and negotiate with various jewelry buyers. It was a painful process for both of us, seeing decades of our family history reduced to cold, hard cash. But it was a necessary step for her to understand the real-world consequences of the financial mess she had helped create. One afternoon, she counted $180,000 in bills on the kitchen table. She told me it was less than she hoped for, but she thought it might be enough to settle the most predatory debts. She was genuinely worried that if she didn't pay something soon, the banks would foreclose on everything, including the house we were sitting in. The irony was almost overwhelming. She was terrified of losing a home I already owned outright, using the proceeds of a legacy she had nearly squandered to pay for the sins of the man who ruined her. She had matured significantly in just a few weeks. The woman who had once sold my truck without a second thought was now meticulously investigating every cent and prioritizing debts with real collateral. That night, Mr. Peterson called me with an incredible update. His team had located Edward in Paris. It turned out he was attempting to secure French residency through a sham marriage with a young waitress. More importantly, they found concrete evidence that he had deliberately falsified Angela's signature to commit fraud. This evidence changed everything legally. It meant Angela could be cleared of all responsibility for the loans Edward had taken out behind her back. I told Mr. Peterson to start the legal proceedings immediately, but to keep it a secret from her. I didn't want to give her false hope until the victory was absolute. When I hung up, I lied to Angela about the call, telling her it was just a wrong number. Lying was becoming strangely easy as I navigated this double life as both the poor widow and the wealthy architect. I watched Angela struggle through the next 2 weeks. She learned how to stretch a tiny food budget, how to talk down aggressive creditors, and how to look for work with a ruined credit score. It was a harsh education, but she took it with a new kind of grit. She came home one evening with swollen feet, telling me she had been on 3 interviews. 2 rejected her instantly due to her legal baggage, but the third offered her a job cleaning offices at night. I asked if she would actually take it. She told me she had no choice because the pay, while meager, was better than nothing. She wanted to work nights so she could continue her search for a professional career during the daylight hours. It broke my heart to see my daughter, who had once been so arrogant and comfortable, preparing to scrub floors, but it also made me immensely proud. She was finally taking full responsibility for her life rather than expecting me to save her. She told me she refused to be a burden to me any longer. One night while Angela was at her new job, my neighbor Aurora stopped by for tea. She remarked on how much Angela had changed not just in her circumstances, but in her spirit. Aurora noted that when Angela first left for Europe, she was insufferably arrogant, but now she seemed genuinely humble. Aurora wondered if she had finally learned the value of the things she had taken for granted. I listened, realizing that Aurora had seen exactly what I was trying to achieve with this elaborate plan. Aurora observed that many people thought I would never forgive Angela after the way she had treated me. She asked if I thought I was doing the right thing by taking her back in. I told her that Angela was my daughter, and that was that. But Aurora pushed further, saying that Angela needed to respect me as a strong woman who built a life, not just as a safety net. This confirmed my resolve. The goal was to transform our relationship from one of dependency to one of mutual, mature respect. When Angela returned from her first shift, she looked exhausted but carried herself with a new kind of dignity. She told me about a coworker named Mrs. Johnson, a 60-year-old woman who had been cleaning offices for 20 years to support her children. Mrs. Johnson had told her there were 2 types of people in their line of work: those who never had a chance, and those who threw their chances away. Angela had admitted to the woman that she was in the second group. Angela sat at the table and told me that these weeks had been the most important of her life because she finally understood that money and luxury were nothing compared to having people who love you. She apologized again, acknowledging that I had every right to hate her for what she did. She promised that she wouldn't stop until she proved she had truly changed. Seeing her growth, I knew it was finally time to involve her in the legal resolution. The following morning, Mr. Peterson called to say the paperwork was ready. I told Angela I had made an appointment with a lawyer who might be able to help with her debts, though I didn't give her the specifics. She was worried about the cost, but I told her not to concern herself with that for now. We drove to the city, and she looked nervous in her professional clothes. which now hung loosely on her frame from the stress of the past month. In Mr. Peterson's office, she was clearly prepared for more bad news. She told him right away that she couldn't afford high fees, but he just smiled and handed her a thick folder. As she read through the documents, her face transformed from a mask of worry to one of pure shock. The papers detailed the evidence of Edward's fraud and confirmed that she was being legally cleared of the debts. She couldn't believe that the signatures had been proven as forgeries. She looked at the lawyer and asked how all of this was possible, and who had paid for the investigation. Mr. Peterson looked at me, and I knew it was time to step out of my role as the helpless victim. I told her that her father had been much more careful than anyone realized. I explained that I wasn't the poor widow she thought I was, and that I had been the one behind the Robert Investments Company that had served her the eviction notice. I watched as her brain tried to process the information. I explained that I had bought back the beach house and the truck, and that I had hired the private investigators to track Edward to Paris. I told her that I had let her work the cleaning job and sell the jewelry because I needed her to understand what it felt like to lose everything you don't appreciate. The room was silent as the magnitude of my performance finally dawned on her. She didn't get angry. Instead, she started to cry, but these were different tears. They were tears of relief, mixed with a profound sense of awe. She realized that while she had been trying to discard me, I had been silently spending a fortune to rebuild her life from the shadows. I told her that the money didn't matter, but her character did. I wanted a daughter who stood on her own 2 feet, and that was exactly who was sitting across from me now. I told her the apartment building where she lived was hers to manage, but only if she worked for it. I wasn't going to hand her a life of leisure. I was going to give her a career. She would oversee the properties Robert had invested in, learning the business from the ground up just as he had. She nodded eagerly, promising that she would never take her family or her responsibilities for granted ever again. The lesson had been harsh, but the result was a daughter I could finally be proud of. We left the office and walked out into the bright afternoon sun. For the first time in years, there were no secrets between us. We got into Robert's old Ford truck, and I let her drive. As we headed toward the beach house for the weekend, I felt Robert's presence with us, his silent plan finally complete. We weren't just 2 women trying to survive anymore. We were a family that had been broken and rebuilt into something much stronger than before. As the ocean came into view, Angela reached over and squeezed my hand. She thanked me for not giving up on her when she had given up on herself. I told her that a mother's love is the ultimate investment, and sometimes, you have to let the market crash before you can see the true value of what you hold. We pulled into the driveway of the cream-colored house. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was finally home. Mr. Peterson leaned back in his leather chair, a slight smile playing on his lips. "We found enough evidence to prove that you were a victim of identity fraud, Angela," he said firmly. "The signatures on those loan documents were forgeries." Angela stared at the papers, her hands shaking. "But how is that possible? Who paid for this investigation? I don't have the money for a private detective or high-end legal research." Mr. Peterson didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me. It was the moment I had been preparing for over several months. "Angela," I began, my voice steady for the first time in a very long time. "There is something I need to tell you, something your father and I kept hidden for your own protection." She looked at me, her eyes red from crying, confused by the shift in my tone. I took a deep breath, shedding the skin of the fragile, poor widow she believed me to be. "Your father left me more than you knew. Much more than a pension and an old truck. He left me a legacy that he built in secret over 45 years. I nodded to Mr. Peterson, who pulled out a second, much thicker folder. "Show her the other documents," I said. This folder didn't contain fraud reports. It held property deeds, bank statements, investment certificates, and the founding papers of the holding company. Angela read the documents in total silence for several minutes. I watched her face transform. She went through a dizzying range of emotions: confusion, disbelief, pure shock, and finally, a heavy sense of comprehension as she realized the magnitude of the truth. "Mom," she whispered, her finger tracing a line on a bank statement. "This says you are the owner of the apartment building where I lived with Edward. It says you have 6 other properties and investments worth millions." I nodded. "Yes, Angela. And it means that when you sold the beach house, you were selling property that belonged to me through a company I control. The sale was fraudulent, and I have already legally reclaimed the house. It was never yours to sell, but it was always mine to protect." Angela stared at the papers, her mind clearly racing to catch up with this new reality. "How long have you known this?" she asked. I told her the truth. I had known since the day she called me from the doctor's office to tell me she had discarded me. She realized that while she was off in Europe spending stolen money, I was sitting in my house, fully aware of my wealth. You knew you could solve all my problems when I came back begging for help. You watched me cry every night and knew you had the money to fix it all. There was a long, tense silence in the room as the weight of my decision settled between us. Angela closed the folders and looked directly into my eyes, searching for a reason. Why, Mom? Why did you let me suffer like that when you could have ended it with a single phone call? This was the pivotal question of our entire relationship. I told her it was because she needed to learn a lesson that money couldn't buy. She needed to understand the true value of the things she had so callously thrown away. I explained that when she abandoned me, she didn't just take my money, she took my dignity and shattered my trust. If I had rescued her, the moment she stepped off that plane, she would have learned nothing. She would have seen me as a bank account rather than a mother. She needed to hit rock bottom so she could learn to save herself, rather than waiting for a benefactor to bail her out of her own bad decisions. I wanted her to find her own strength in the ruins of her mistakes. Angela started to cry again, but these were different tears. They weren't the tears of self-pity I had seen for weeks. They were tears of deep, painful understanding. I abandoned you when you needed me most, she sobbed. I treated you like garbage. I didn't sugarcoat it. I told her that she had. And you saved me anyway, she added. I corrected her, saying I saved her by letting her struggle. I didn't give her a handout. I gave her the opportunity to rediscover her own character through hard, honest work. Mr. Peterson stepped in to handle the technical details. He informed her that all legal expenses to free her from Edward's fraudulent debts had been paid in full by me. She was officially free of any legal obligations to the banks or the private lenders Edward had deceived. Angela looked at her hands, then at me. And the cleaning job I got. I suppose I can quit now. I told her she could, but I hoped she wouldn't. I wanted her to keep working because that job was teaching her the dignity of effort. I explained that the job was giving her something she never had when her life was easy. An appreciation for every dollar earned, and respect for the people society often overlooks. Angela wiped her face and looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't the look of a dependent child, but the look of a grown woman who finally respected another woman. She asked if I could ever truly forgive her, and I told her I had forgiven her long ago. The real challenge was whether she could forgive herself. After Mr. Peterson left us alone, the silence in the office felt peaceful rather than heavy. Angela admitted that even if I hadn't been rich, she would have learned the same lesson. She realized that the only thing that kept her sane during her darkest moments was knowing she had a home with me. She finally understood that unconditional love was the most valuable asset she possessed. She promised that she would never take that love for granted again, and that she would work every day to earn back the respect she had lost. We left the lawyer's office as two different people. We were no longer a victim and a predator, or a mother and a wayward child. We were two independent women who had chosen to rebuild a life together. Over the following weeks, Angela surprised me. Despite knowing about the fortune, she kept her night cleaning job. She told me she needed to finish what she started and that she couldn't just jump back into a life of luxury as if the last few months hadn't happened. It wasn't a punishment. It was her way of staying grounded. I watched her put on her work uniform every night with a sense of pride. She was no longer the broken woman who had crawled back from Europe. She was someone who had found her own dignity in the most humble of places. One afternoon, Aurora came by and mentioned the rumors spreading through the neighborhood. People were starting to notice that we weren't struggling anymore. I decided it was time to be honest with my old friend. I told her the whole story, from the betrayal to the secret wealth. Aurora was stunned. She called my plan brilliant and terrible at the same time. She understood that while I had let my daughter suffer, it was the only way to ensure she didn't grow up to be a person who relied on others to clean up her messes. We watched Angela through the window as she worked in the garden. She was no longer the daughter who gave orders or treated me like a nuisance. She was a partner in the household, contributing her own earned money to the bills. Angela had even started using her small savings from the cleaning job to help her coworkers. She was assisting a woman named Mrs. Johnson with daycare costs, showing a level of empathy she had never possessed before. Aurora smiled and noted that the woman in the garden was not the same person who had left for Europe. This new Angela understood that money was just a tool and that true richness came from how you relate to the people around you. It was the best outcome I could have hoped for. One evening, Angela told me that Mrs. Johnson had figured out she came from a wealthy background and asked why she was still scrubbing floors. Angela told her she needed to prove she could stand on her own feet. Mrs. Johnson had told her that was the difference between being rich and acting rich. My daughter sat with me on the sofa and told me she wanted to stay in the house, but only if she could pay her fair share. She wanted our relationship to be a partnership based on mutual respect. She announced her intention to go back to school to study social work. She wanted to use her experience of being abandoned and betrayed to help other women in similar situations. She didn't want to use my money for her degree. She wanted to save up and pay for it herself, one paycheck at a time. It was a perfect transformation. She had found a purpose that was entirely her own. Meanwhile, Edward had been arrested in France, but Angela didn't even care. He was a shadow from a past life. 6 months later, our lives had reached a beautiful, steady balance. Angela was excelling in her studies, and I had used a portion of Robert's fortune to establish a foundation for women facing financial abuse. We spent our weekends at the beach house, the sanctuary that was now filled with laughter instead of secrets. Every time I saw her drive Robert's old truck, I felt a sense of completion. The truck was no longer a relic of the past. It was a symbol of a future we had built together. Aurora joined us for tea one Friday and confessed that she finally understood why I had been so cruel. She saw the strength in Angela's eyes and the serenity in our home. She saw a daughter who bought vegetables for families in need and a mother who had successfully navigated the most difficult journey of her life. As the sun set over the ocean, I realized that Robert's final gift wasn't the money or the houses. It was the opportunity for me to become the mother Angela truly needed. We sat on the porch of the beach house, watching the waves roll in. Angela looked over at me and thanked me for the hard lessons. I told her that a mother's love is a powerful thing. It can be a soft pillow, but it can also be a mirror that forces you to see who you really are. We sat in the fading light, two women who had lost everything only to find something much more permanent. The shadows of the past were gone, replaced by a horizon that was finally clear and bright. I was deeply moved when Angela explained her reasoning for using her own hard-earned money to help others. When I asked why she didn't just rely on the government budgets or the foundation's vast resources, she looked at me with a newfound clarity. She told me that some things simply cannot be measured in official budgets or managed through cold paperwork. For her, it was about the personal connection and the tangible sacrifice of her own time and effort. It was the final proof that she no longer saw money as an abstract concept to be manipulated, but as a tool for genuine, human compassion. That night, Angela and I sat out on the porch for dinner, a simple activity that had blossomed into a sacred tradition for us. This was our designated time to talk about the small details of our day, plan for the various projects we were working on, and simply enjoy the quiet presence of one another. As she was cutting her salad, she mentioned that she had received a very strange letter that morning. I felt my muscles instantly tense up, fearing it might be a new threat or a reminder of the past. I asked her who it was from, and she calmly replied that it was from Edward. The mention of his name sent a shiver through me. I asked if he had actually written to her and where he was sending letters from. She explained that he was writing from a prison in France, where he had been sentenced to 2 years for his role in marriage fraud. In the letter, Edward claimed that he regretted everything he had done and was reaching out to ask for her forgiveness. I watched her face closely, looking for any sign of the old vulnerability or anger. I asked her how she felt about hearing from the man who had nearly ruined our lives. "Honestly, Mom, I don't feel anything at all," she said, her voice steady and devoid of emotion. She explained that she felt no anger, no lingering sadness, and absolutely no desire for revenge. It was as if that entire chapter of her life had happened decades ago to a different person entirely. I asked if she intended to write back to him, and she shook her head firmly. It wasn't out of a sense of lingering hatred, but rather because she felt there was nothing left to say. The Angela who had loved him was gone, replaced by a woman who had nothing in common with the man in that prison cell. I was profoundly impressed by the maturity and the inner strength in her voice. The woman sitting across from me was someone who had truly been through the fire and come out stronger on the other side. She told me that this entire experience had taught her a vital lesson about the nature of love. She realized that true love isn't the kind that tells you exactly what you want to hear to keep you comfortable. True love is the kind that teaches you what you actually need to learn, even when the lesson is incredibly painful to endure. She acknowledged that Edward had only told her what she wanted to hear, making her feel special and convincing her that she deserved a life of luxury without any personal effort. In contrast, she realized that I had taught her the much harder truth, that real wealth is built on hard work, mutual respect, and genuine, honest relationships. After she went to her room to study, I stayed on the porch alone. I looked up at the stars and thought of Robert, feeling that I had finally fulfilled the promise I made to him on the day he died. I hadn't taken care of our daughter by shielding her from the world or giving her a mountain of cash. I had taken care of her by teaching her how to stand on her own 2 feet and survive. I hadn't saved her by solving every problem that came her way. I had saved her by stepping back and allowing her the space to solve them herself. The following morning was Sunday, and we had planned a trip to the beach house together. It was the first time she had been ready to go back since I reclaimed the property, as she had needed time to process her guilt. The drive to the coast was silent, but it was a comfortable, peaceful silence. As we pulled into the driveway, Angela stayed in the truck for a moment, just staring at the house that held so many of our family memories. She noted that while the house looked exactly the same, everything else had changed. She made a point to say that she was no longer the same person who had so casually sold the property months ago. We walked inside together, and the house was exactly as Robert and I had always kept it: clean, tidy, and filled with light. Angela walked through every single room, touching the old furniture and lingering over the family photos on the walls. She turned to me and offered a specific apology for the house. She wasn't just apologizing for the sale anymore. She was apologizing for reducing 40 years of birthdays, Christmases, and summers into a mere commercial transaction. She sat on the sofa where Robert used to read his Sunday newspaper and admitted that she could finally feel his presence again. She could hear his laughter and smell his morning coffee in the very walls of the home. I assured her that he had always been there, watching over us both. She smiled, saying she believed he would be proud of how I had handled the situation. As the day went on, we worked together to clean the windows, fix small details, and cook a meal. It was a ritual of reconnection that went beyond the physical house. As the sun began to set, we sat on the porch Robert had built with his own hands. Angela then made a proposal that truly surprised me. She wanted to turn the beach house into a temporary shelter for women escaping domestic violence. It was a beautiful, perfect idea that I knew Robert would have loved. She suggested that the house could be a place where women could find peace while they rebuilt their lives from the ground up. I told her it was a wonderful plan and that we could use the foundation's resources to make it happen. I asked if she was sure she wanted to share our family sanctuary with strangers. And she replied that the best sanctuaries are the ones that are open to people in need. She finally understood that a house isn't a home until its doors are open to others. We returned home that night with a sense of purpose and a relationship that was completely renewed. We were no longer bound by mere obligation. We were two independent women who had chosen to build a life together based on respect and a common goal. Before I fell asleep, I spoke to Robert in the quiet of my room, telling him that we had finally done it. Our daughter understood what truly mattered. Justice hadn't come as revenge or punishment, but as a profound transformation. We had gained something much more valuable than any inheritance: an authentic, unbreakable bond. I hope you enjoyed this journey of growth, justice, and family. It is a reminder that sometimes the hardest thing to do is also the most loving. I am currently sharing these stories with you from the heart of the United States, and I would love to know which city you are listening from today. Please join me in the comments section to share your thoughts on Antonia and Angela's story. If this narrative touched you, please consider supporting the channel so I can continue to bring you more life stories like this one. On your screen now, you can see 2 more highly recommended stories that explore the complexities of human relationships and the power of second chances. There is so much more to discover on my channel, so don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. I look forward to reading your comments and seeing you in the next life story. Until then, I am sending you all my love and respect. See you soon.